disappointing to some of you. However, if need be, I will definitely stay as long as we need. All right, so let me ask you this. What do you think the number one problem I'm seeing with contracts is right now? If you are on and in your car, please mute yourself. All right, Jai, I don't know if you're in there. Can you monitor the ones that aren't muted just in case, and just go ahead and mute them if there's background noise. All right, I'll ask again, either put it in the chat box or speak up. What do you think the number one problem I'm seeing with contracts is right now?
Not having the information completed for the due diligence termination.
Tell me more about that. That's not what I was going for, but what do you mean by that?
So like the address, having page 9 completely filled out with like where.
So not knowing where the termination money goes. That's a good one. That's not where I was thinking, but yeah, that is a problem. And that is a problem. So that's a good one. All right. Who else? I'll give you 3 more chances. Come on, we can do it. All right, not having it in writing. Some of you are like, oh, come on, it can't be that simple. Everyone gets everything in writing. I am dealing with more issues right now because something wasn't putting in writing. And let me tell you something, it's not just with new agents. We are just kind of casually having conversations, thinking that's okay. Anything from repairs done prior to closing by the buyer to repairs supposed to be done prior to closing by the seller to a lot of different things. So when in doubt, absolutely write everything out. Now, obviously, we can't practice law. So if you are coming up with agreements, you do need to have an attorney draw those up, or at least reach out to me to see if we have any verbiage ahead of time. So I'll get more specific on that as we get to those sections, but there should be no agreement between any parties of the contract that are not in writing. Otherwise, you really don't have anything except for a bunch of back and forth or copies and screenshots of text messages and all of those things, which help. However, it doesn't hold up. So just keep that in mind. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're not gonna traditionally go through the contract like we have before. I'm gonna fly through it and then stop in sections that I've highlighted again, where I'm seeing issues coming up here recently. So we'll share my screen. Evan, give me a thumbs up if you can see the contract right now. Sweet. All righty. So we've got the contract. Here we go. A couple things I want to talk about in section 1 that does become an issue quite often is this definition right here of party. Party is defined as the buyer or the seller. Parties is defined as both buyer and the seller. So quick pop quiz after that lengthy presentation I had on party. Who is not a party to the contract? I love it. Devin and Celeste pointed at themselves. You, as the agent, you are not a party to the contract. Even if you are the buyer or the seller, you and your role as the agent are not party to the contract. Here's where that's showing up. Negotiating your commissions, giving credits, reducing your commission, et cetera, et cetera. That is not to be written in the contract. If there's any sort of reduction of commissions, or any change in the commission, so let's just start from one side. If there's any change in commission on the buyer side, you need to have that in writing by changing your buyer agency agreement if they're paying. If you're giving them a credit at closing, that needs to be in writing with me, with my signature authorizing it, that you just give to the attorney, and the attorney makes the adjustment at closing. If you're reducing your commission from the seller side, that needs to be done by changing your listing agreement. Or if there's some negotiations between you and the agent to make the deal work, you will need to draw up a compensation agreement. A compensation agreement. So everyone knows what a buyer's agreement and a listing agreement is. A compensation agreement, I know because these are not in alphabetical order, it's going to take me forever to find. But in case you've never seen it, it is towards the top. Form 120. This is a compensation agreement. So this can be written between you and the listing agent. This can be written between you and the seller. This can be written between you and the buyer, but any change in compensation will be put on a compensation agreement. Okay, so that's your first pitfall that we're going to go through today. Any questions about that before I move on? All right. A big crowd today. I like it. 22 people want to learn how to not mess up on a contract. I'll take that. All right, let's keep going through. Find out some other areas that are jumping out at us right now. This one. This contract is or is not contingent upon the sale and closing of a buyer's real property, and SCR Form 504 is or is not attached. Couple issues here. So first one, what this is saying is whether or not the contract is contingent on the buyer having to sell a home. This does not have anything to do with their financing. The buyer could have $2 million in the bank and they can still write it contingent on their current home selling. If you accept it as the seller, you've accepted it. So if they, if they don't sell their home, but they can still purchase the home, it doesn't matter. They are protected by this form, by this contingency. The second part is whether or not you have specific guidelines for this contingency mapped out in the contract. As a listing agent, I can't dictate what a seller does, but as a listing agent, there are very few times where I would recommend that a seller move forward with the contract being checked off as is contingent without having Form 504 being attached. There's not really a time that you would want to do it. From a buyer's agent standpoint, same thing applies. A lot of people are saying, well, I mean, if it's not filled out, then the buyer just has until closing in order to close on their house. Maybe, yet is that really, do you really think that's how the buyer, or the seller sees this? Probably not. So having Form 504 is a very important form to have in here. So what's Form 504? Let's jump to that. This is Form 504. I'm going to run through this not too quickly because, again, this is an important one to understand. First is identifying the buyer's property. So what property is the buyer needing to sell in order to purchase this current home? So you'll put their property address in here. Then it's going to specify whether or not it is currently under contract. And if so, is that contract attached to this offer? And then if the property is currently under contract, they will deliver Form 500 to the seller, which we will come back to. Then you will say, okay, whether or not it is or is not, but let's just say it's not currently under contract. And the next part will say the property is listed or was listed on whatever date by whatever agent and brokerage firm, and is or is not listed in the multiple listing service. So is it listed? When was it listed? Who listed it? And is it an exclusive listing versus a general brokerage listing, and therefore would have to be in the MLS? Obviously, it's super important. It's going to make a big difference to your seller whether or not listen, I'm not terribly upset if it's not under contract. However, if it's not listed, I want to at least know why it's going to be listed, or when it's going to be listed. Now that you have all the first information, you're then going to have the dates on when the property must be under contract. So we're just going to use today. Today's February 28th. And let's say we're submitting the offer today, and the offer is set to close middle of April. We'll do April 15th just to keep even days. So I'm going to say that the contract will be the buyer's property will be under contract no later than, let's say, March 15th. Buyer shall deliver in writing the seller a signed completed Form 500 with 48 hours of ratification of the contract. If the buyer's property is not under contract by this date, then either party may terminate by using SCR Form 313, which is the notice of termination. Everybody with me so far on this? All right. If you are not muted and in your car or moving around, if you don't mind muting yourself, that would be fantastic. All right. Next section of 504. Sale contingency. This contract is contingent upon the marketing and closing of the buyer's property no later than blank date. So you've established up here when it'll be under contract, and then you've established here when it will be closed. Two big things you also want to keep in mind. If you have a no later than, let's say in this one, it says no later than March 31st, and then it will close no later than April 15th. Where's the challenge there?
You
Quick
want to
closing,
stretch
if
Go ahead, Wayne. I saw your name pop up first.
quick closing, if it goes under contract on March 31st, you really have to move fast to get it closed by the 15th.
Correct. So you want to monitor these things, because if you ratify the contract here, March 20th comes along, seller starts to say, hey, we're within 30 days of when we're supposed to close. Their house isn't under contract. Let's put this thing back on the market. You can't. You have to keep it under contract as long as the buyer wants to stay in there, because you've given the buyer till March 31st to get that home under contract, even if it may be completely unrealistic that they're not going to get an all cash offer that's going to close in 10 days. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind when you are looking at these two dates. All right, move forward. Buyer will within X calendar days deliver the seller notice that the buyer's property sale has closed. This should be within 2 calendar days. There's no reason there should be a delay on this. Should the property not close by this date, buyer may terminate this contract to the seller using Form 313. So at that point, if it doesn't close by that date, you can then terminate as the buyer. This is separate from due diligence. If the contract on the buyer's property is terminated after the date mentioned above in section 1, but before the buyer's sale deadline, either party may terminate delivering Form 313. So what that means is, let's say we had up here that it was going to be under contract by March 15th. So it goes under contract. And we had it would close no later than April 15th. But let's say on March 31st, the contract falls through. At that point, the buyer's property is terminated after the date mentioned above, but before the sale date, then the buyer or the seller may terminate at that point. The buyer won't be held to the contract because they're not under contract anymore. Okay. All right. Should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the date above, seller may, doesn't have to, may terminate this contract by using Form 313, unless the party agree on a cash buyer, meaning the buyer verifies that they can purchase the property without it, or their financing is not contingent upon the buyer selling. So they can do either one of those. If they can do either one of those, if it doesn't close, then then the buyer can stay in the contract.
Joseph?
Yes.
It's Nancy Williams. Okay, so can you just go through again, if they make an offer and their home is under agreement, so it says buyer's home is, under contract, and that falls through, how do you handle that?
If it falls through, then the buyer at this point, based on this one, if the contract on the buyer's property is terminated after the date mentioned above, which it clearly would be because it was under contract when they did it, but before the buyer's sale date, so obviously you would still have this date here, then in that situation, Nancy, then they would just, they could, either party could terminate by delivering notice.
So you still fill in the sale contingency, the marketing and closing, whether you check, yes, it is under contract, or no, it's not under contract?
Correct, because you want to put the date at which it needs to close once it goes under contract if it's not currently, or date in which it's going to close based on the current contract you have.
You still have an opportunity to resell it if you have that date there. You still have a chance.
You do, however, if you are under contract, right? And then let's say you don't put a date here, which you shouldn't do. I would put a date. I'd still use, let's say you submitted the offer today, it was under contract. As a buyer's agent, I'd still put no later than the 15th. If it falls through after the 15th, at that point, the seller can terminate because you're after the date that the contract, the house is to go under contract.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So if the buyer fails to meet any of the timeframes above, Either party may terminate the contract by delivering the notice form 313. All right, let's talk about the buyer's property duties as we go into this. Number one, they make only good faith efforts and actions that sell their property, meaning you can't have it under or have it on the market and then not try to sell it. Not that there would be a reason you would do that. Timely inform the sellers and brokers of pertinent information regarding the sale of the property. Pertinent information means there's a problem with the financing. I would say over deliver the information. There's nothing in this that says, let's just put ourselves in that situation. Let's say I'm the buyer's agent, Nancy's the listing agent. Let's say I'm under contract, everything's fine, everything's good. This section 3B says timely inform seller and broker of pertinent information regarding the sale of the property. My client comes to me and says, hey, we're having trouble with financing, or the buyer's agent or the lender comes to me and says, having trouble with financing. I'm going to go ahead and let Nancy know, saying, hey, I'm just giving you a heads up. They're having some issues on the financing of their property. And that, it hasn't affected closing yet, but I'm just giving you a heads up. The seller can't terminate based on that information in this case, but at least you've let them know. The seller can only terminate if their contract actually does fall through. Okay. And then timely direct brokers or law firms to disclose pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. That's just basically saying that the broker and law firms can discuss this information with the parties. All right, section 4. This is an area that we also we had a lot of questions on. Is marketing and subsequent offers. Seller may continue to market the property and may accept an offer as a backup contract using Form 391. Note, MLS rules may require categorization of seller's listing as something other than active. Our MLS rules do state that it has to be active contingent. It is that is the most basic and clear representation of the situation. So if you have a home that's under contract, even with a home sale contingency in there, you still have to mark it as active contingent. There is no way around this. I get this question a lot. What if everyone agrees? It doesn't matter. By saying active, when there's an active contingent option, you are not honestly and fairly representing the status of the property. Because fast forward, let's say you do that. Let's say everyone agrees. The buyer even says, you know what, keep it as active. I bring you a buyer and I write you a contract, and then you come back and say, this is awesome. You're now a backup offer, or we've got to get out of this under contract. How do you think that's going to make me feel or the buyer feel that just put an offer into that house? Especially if it's a good contract and they've spent all this time going to see the property, put it on out there. Now, again, it's not a perfect situation. Just keep that in mind. All right. Upon seller delivering notice of acceptance of a backup offer, the buyer shall, within blank calendar days, choose one of the following. Meaning, if the seller gets a backup offer, Nancy gets a backup offer. And they let me know, then I can do a couple things. Number one, I can deliver Form 500 showing that my property is under contract and scheduled to close by the deadlines above. So Nancy comes to me. She says, Joseph, good news is we've got a backup offer. I need to let you know because now you've got to execute one of the 4 things in section 4. I can go back with Form 500 and say, great, we actually just got an contract on this. So we're under contract and the contract states we're going to close in time based on everything above. At that point, you're fine. You don't have to do anything else. The backup offer remains a backup offer. It does not become a primary offer. And I'm still protected as the buyer with the home sale contingency. So if everything falls through on mine, I'm still protected by this, but I'm still the primary offer, or excuse me, contract. Or if I can't do that, I can remove the sale contingency only if the closing of my property is not required for me to obtain purchase money. So I can say, sure, I'm going to remove it, but if I then can't get financing, confirmed financing, obviously then that would not be staying within the spirit of the contract. I can agree to become the new backup offer, or I can terminate the contract. If I don't timely properly comply with A or B, meaning I can't deliver the form or I can't remove the contingency, then I remain in primary first contact position ahead of the subsequent potential buyers, and seller may only accept the subsequent offer as a backup offer using Form 391. Everybody signs on the next page. Everybody, sorry, it says if buyer does, sorry. Everybody with me on that one? Form 504, backup offer, excuse me, contingent on home sale. All right, that's pitfall number one. Actually, I think that was number two. Maybe even three. Let's find some more. All right, so going back to the purchase and sale agreement. Let's see, property description. This one's just kind of a side note. We've gotten this quite a bit. If you've got multiple properties listed or multiple properties in a situation, two parcels of land next to each other, a house is on one piece of property, a loan on another, two pieces of property, regardless, and the taxes it's showing up as two separate pieces of property. Two separate contracts is not necessary. However, you are going to want to make sure under the tax map section here, you have clearly delineated the different tax map numbers that are on here. If you have to have an addendum that attaches it, you want to do that, but you want to make sure that you have all of them covered on here to make sure that they're all represented in the sale. You also need to make sure that the attorney is going to be okay with that based on how they're writing title, title insurance, etc. However, for the initial offer, negotiations, etc., that's what you want to do. Let's see here. Sure, I'm not missing any questions or comments. Nope. All right. Pitfalls, pitfalls, pitfalls. Earnest money. Here we go. Earnest money. Unless the buyer is submitting an offer with a cashier's check that's being delivered directly to the attorney's office, very rarely are you going to have earnest money. Let's just say, for the example, it's $5,000. Are you going to have earnest money with $5,000 accompanying the offer? If that earnest money has not been turned in or not ready to be turned in when this offer is submitted, then it is going to be option B, which is the $5,000 will be paid by 6 p.m. on blank date. There is no reason that date should not be within 2 calendar days. Unless you're anticipating some lengthy negotiations back and forth, that should be very quick to have the earnest money turned in. It should be paid in check or other. Where cash is an option, please don't do it. Have them go to get a cashier's check or whatever it may be if they are wanting to pay check. Here or cash. Last part, pitfall, if earnest money is not delivered by the agreed upon date above, seller may, does not have to, may terminate this agreement by delivering notice of termination. Here's where this gets tricky. You submit an offer today. Evan submits an offer on my listing today. It's February 28th. He's a very proactive buyer's agent. So in the negotiations, he's already set up the inspections and he's got the inspector coming out tomorrow. So we've ratified the contract. Earnest money's not due till Friday. Evan's got his inspector out there tomorrow. Inspector realizes that this house is no bueno. And buyer was like, I'm not giving the earnest money and I'm not paying the termination fee. So now you haven't submitted your earnest money, but you're within the deadline. And the buyer's mad and they're saying, well, I'm not going to pay the termination fee, which is $1,000. And therefore you have very little recourse from the listing side because you haven't seen the earnest money turned in because Evan was smart and he put the earnest money not being due for 2 to 3 days out and you have no way to claim it. So again, is there a way to prevent that situation? Have the earnest money turned in sooner if you can, and also do a very good job clearly explaining to your buyers that earnest money and termination fee are two completely different things. Okay, so again, there's not a black and white situation. There's not a black and white answer when it comes to these. There's just things you want to keep in mind. So if I'm a listing agent and I get Evan's offer, I'm like, sweet, not only has he got it ratified, he's already got an inspection scheduled tomorrow. I like this. I'm also going to say, hey, Evan, earnest money is not coming in until Friday. Can we get that sooner? Do we need to get that sooner? I just want to make sure we're not having the buyer thinking that they're just going to be able to do things for free. Now, one could argue the buyer's in breach of contract and you can battle it out. And the answer is yes, you can battle all of this out. However, you don't want to always. So just keep in mind on that. Questions? All right, here we go. Let's find the next one. All right, transaction costs. Let's see, where do we see some issues here? Two of them. Number one, well, there's all kinds of issues, first of all. Let's see. First one, seller or buyer are responsible for obtaining information, private transfer fees, public transfer fees, or any cost that transfer fee, which could be certificates of assessment, capital contributions, working capital, estoppel fees, otherwise named fees, anything the HOA wants to charge at the transaction, they can charge. If it's in their bylaws, they're going to charge it. Here's where this comes up. You've got a seller who's got a home in, I won't pick a neighborhood because I won't pick on them. You've got a seller that's lived in a neighborhood for 20 years. And they get this and they say, and it says the seller's going to pay for it. And the seller's like, you know what? This deal's close enough. We've been waiting too long. Let's negotiate it out. I'm not worried about this. We don't have an estoppel fee. We don't have a contribution fee. That's where we're getting hit right now. Then you fast forward to closing and they find out that on the HOA meeting a year and a half ago that they didn't go to because they've lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. They don't care about the HOA. They don't pay attention to it. They realize that the HOA had voted in to have a capital contribution fee. So anytime there's a property purchased in that neighborhood, they have to contribute 0.5 of 1%, whatever it may be, ends up being anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000. Well, now the seller is upset because they didn't know about it. So how do you prevent that pitfall? In your listing presentation, you want to make sure that your seller confirms in writing, or you connect them with the HOA and you get confirmation in writing from the HOA that there is no contribution or any additional fees that they're unaware of. If no box is checked, this will be added to the seller's transaction costs. So that's also where it can get you in trouble. Next part, pitfall in this section. I'm going to be a strong negotiator. Evan's going to come in, great buyer's agent, get lots of money. And then you find out you got too much money. So you were putting an offer on a house, you got $300,000 house, you get negotiate in $12,000 in closing costs. Then you find out from the lender that all the buyer can actually get is $10,000 in closing costs. That money very specifically states right here, if the amount exceeds the actual amount of those costs or amount allowed by the lender, then the excess funds will revert to the seller. Will revert to the seller. That money cannot be given to the buyer in any way, shape, or form. I won't name any names, but I happen to know of someone who is, I think I saw their name on here, that was a seller in a transaction where this happened. And very casually, the buyer and the buyer's agent were like, hey, there's a difference of X amount. If you will, just leave a check in the kitchen drawer. Not there. Listen, when I say that, none of the buyer nor the buyer's agent were trying to be anything. They just figured that's how it would work. That cannot happen. They're specifically stated in the closing documents. That cannot happen. There cannot be any money that changed hands outside of closing. So that becomes a windfall for the seller. So as a buyer's agent, if you're asking for a lot of closing costs, you want to be very clear with the lender to say, look, this is a lot. and I think we're going to get it. And that would be great. And my buyer would be happy. However, I would rather know if they can't get the full $12,000, they can only get 10, then we at least come down $2,000 on the closing costs. So just make sure you pay attention to that. All right. Financing. Honestly, the financing one, there's a couple things on this. We can get into the details of the percentages, et cetera. Couple things. Buyer must make timely good faith efforts to apply for and obtain financing.
Joseph?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I ran into that before where the lender would not let us know what the closing costs would be upfront.
Okay.
So we did ask for more, but the way we handled it is we did a buy down of points with the lender, and that kind of settled it out.
Correct. And so that's the conversation you want to have with the lender. Is there sometimes that's an option, sometimes that's not though. So you just want to make sure that in the event it's not, because they could already be at a rate where they can't get any lower. But yeah, you definitely want to at least have the conversation with the lender, because again, the lenders, most savvy lenders are, you're right, they're not going to come back and say, well, yeah, I can get them 12,000 or I can do it. They'll say, well, in the event I can only get them 10, I know I can then allocate the additional 2 somewhere else. They will say that. They may not give you the exact number on the closing costs until they get everything, but they will be able to tell you one way or the other.
Yeah. And the other part, I'm sorry, one more time about the estoppel fees and all of that.
Mhm.
If I'm representing the seller, I always say, well, the buyers are the ones that are going to live into that neighborhood. So they're the one contributing to that fee. And, the seller should not have to be paying for that.
I agree with that conceptually. However, it still has to be put in the contract. So
Okay.
I would say,
But
yeah.
it's not fair to do so, right?
No. I think it's a very good
Okay.
argument to say to the buyer, yeah, you're paying the contribution fee.
Right.
So
Because it's just enhancing the HOA for continuing to improve the properties where they're living, but the
Correct.
seller is way out.
Yeah, correct.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
All right, so on to financing, timely and good faith effort. So again, timely and good faith means get all the documents, get all the things you need to do. Make sure your buyer is lined up, because what you don't want to have happen is you get to a week before closing, financing falls through, which, by the way, let's just go down to this one right here. Right here. Final loan approval comes when lender funds the loan. Okay, so that literally could be while they're signing, where technically, as this is written, is final loan approval. However, what's happening is the week of closing or the day before closing, financing falls through. Buyer's covered. It's not, it's before the loan. Don't think for a second that that seller is not going to do everything they can to find out what went wrong, and all it's going to take is one little comment from the lender and it could be legitimate. This says, well, the buyer didn't get us this in time, or the buyer didn't do this, and those sorts of things. If that's the case, one would argue that they did not take timely or good faith efforts to apply for and obtain the financing. So you want to make sure you set up your buyer for success to get everything that they need. Again, most of these problems are solved in your buyer consultation. Make sure that they know that they are going to be in a pressure cooker. You can be nicer about it if you want, but not too nice, because they need to know that there's a lot of issues that can come from this moving forward, and they need to get everything to them. All right, due diligence. Here's all the pitfalls. So a couple different pitfalls on due diligence. Number one, we still have people that are a little confused on the due diligence period ending. And what needs to happen. If this expires, I'm going to use the same dates. Today's the 28th. Let's say the due diligence expires the 15th, March 15th. Say they gave them 2 weeks. At 6:01 on the 15th, this house, if you have not changed the contract or terminated the contract at 6:01, even if you're still negotiating repairs, you've submitted requests, you've done all the things. If nothing has been agreed upon, at 6:01, it moves to as is. The buyer is moving forward and as is contract. Specifically states this in very, very large letters, bold letters. During due diligence, should buyer fail to obtain a new amended contract within the or timely not terminate it in time, then the buyer agrees to move and the seller agrees to sell in an as is manner. That's by 6:01. So here's where we're seeing a lot of issues right now. Number one, there's a lot of problems with the house, and you waited too long to get your inspection, or you didn't give yourself enough time to get the inspection or in due diligence, and you're trying to put together all these requests and everything that you're going to do, and you need more time. And let's say it's the 13th now, and Evan, where he started off as a great buyer's agent, now all of a sudden everything's coming to the last minute. Of course, it's not his fault, it's his buyer's fault. And then he submits this repair procedure to me, repair request to me that's 8 pages long, and I got a day to respond. Quite frankly, at that point, most sellers are going to be like, I'm not even looking at this. It's the day before. He's either going to say, I'm going to take it, move forward, or he's going to pay his termination fee and get out. And you've set your buyer up for being in terrible negotiation terms. Because at that point, the seller's got 24 hours to make a decision. And if your termination fee is big enough, their decision may be, you know what, I'm just going to say no, or I'm going to sit on this and see what they decide to do. So you just want to be very, very clear. There's still some thought processes out there. I thought this had gone away, that once you submit the repair, here's where it shows up a lot. Let me pull this up, find it first and pull it up. Here's where we're seeing a big pitfall on this one. Uh-oh. There we go. Nope. Here's where we get real sideways with this due diligence. So same example. Evan's put in an offer. Today's the 28th. Or no, yeah, he put in an offer today. Due diligence expires. The date on the due diligence is 6 p.m. on March 15th. Evan fills this out, which he should. This is the proper form to be used right here. The repair addendum amendment to agreement. This is where they're submitting the repairs and they're requesting the repairs. And then Evan says, he puts down here an expiration. And he one of two things happens with this form. Number one, he puts it on March 17th at 5 p.m. and thinks, hey, I've extended the due diligence by doing so. 100% no gray area, completely incorrect. By the way, for those of you who don't know Evan, I'm totally picking on him. He would never do any of this, but he's on the screen, which is probably why he'll never be on the video again. So don't mistake, this expiration date does not in any way, shape, or form change the original contract. None at all. At all. So the two ways this shows up. Number one's the one I just gave the example. Evan submits it. It says March 17th, which is after due diligence. And everybody thinks, or Evan and his side think, well, I've got till the 17th for them to respond, so I'm protected. You're not at all. Here's the other way it shows up. Evan submits this repair request this week and puts in there March 10th. And does does say, hey, it's due by March 10th. And then on March 11th, they say, well, you didn't agree to these. You're out of contract, so now I can terminate and not be penalized. Not at all. This expiration is first of all, this expiration, one would argue, and I am arguing this, Forums Committee, is completely irrelevant as it relates to this. This is an addendum to a contract. It's not a negotiation. I mean, it's to have a deadline on it. The deadlines are driven in the contract. But a lot of people are thinking, Evan submits this. I don't respond by his given date in here, which is a random date, totally obscure, has nothing to do with the contract. And then if my seller doesn't respond in time, they're going to say, well, you didn't respond in time, so we can get out of the contract. That's not the case. This is simply to reply to this. If I reply and say no, or if I don't reply at all, it's me saying no. If I reply 2 days later, it's me telling you what I'm going to do. This is a back and forth until you decide to either agree on this document, terminate, or move forward. Does that make sense? Questions on that? We're seeing a lot of that one.
I think
All right.
I'm a little bit confused, Joseph.
Okay.
So you're saying the addendum, the expiration date is basically just to respond to that piece of addendum of requesting of repairs or not, but has nothing
Correct.
to terminate the contract.
Has nothing to do with the contract.
And then if the
That's-
seller does not want to move forward, they need to respond, or they don't have to respond to the repair request.
They don't have to respond. If they want to try to get something worked out, I mean, I would advise that they do, but no, they do not have to respond.
Okay, but so they're still within contract. So the buyer really need to send termination letter if the seller does not respond to get out
By
of the
the-
contract.
Yes, by the due diligence date, not the
Correct.
addendum date, by the due diligence date, but correct.
Correct.
Yes,
Okay, all right, perfect.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Celeste.
So might be telling on myself here, but I never put anything in that expiration date in that page.
I honestly think this is not, I'm not an attorney. However, I play one on TV, and I would tell you that that's how I would handle it if I were you. I would not put an expiration there. I think the date on the, put in an first of all, an expiration is not one of the 5 key areas that you need to have a contract. So it doesn't really put anybody at risk by not having it. And number 2, there's no other addendum on the contract that has an expiration date. Like
Yeah, I
it's
mean, it
just
always
this.
goes back to the contract, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the general addendum doesn't have it, the additional addendum and clauses doesn't have it, the 504 form doesn't have it. None of the other addendums of the contract have one. This one does. So you're not telling on yourself.
Oh, okay.
I don't like blanks in a contract. So if you don't like blanks in a contract, just put a dash in it.
Okay.
So,
That's fair.
I have another question regarding due diligence. So,
yes.
so right now I've got a deal. We did inspections. We did the due diligence. We did everything. The final date was the 24th. We negotiated with the listing agents. There are 2 of them. They said we'll drop the price $25,000. They wrote an email and I have a text. I said we agreed to that. Wrote up the addendum to change of terms. Change of terms addendum, and have not gotten anything signed back. The listing agents are not responding at all. So I have it in writing that they will drop the price $25,000 in both email and text. I let them know in writing that we're good with that, but they haven't responded by even, like, I have my buyers have signed the addendum. Now they're not responsive. So what do I do?
All right. So a couple things. When's the due diligence terminate?
It was the 24th.
Okay. Okay. So you're out of due diligence now, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so technically if the seller never signs that and the seller comes back and says, no, I never agreed to it. I don't know where that text or that email came from, because especially it's from the agent. In a most technical sense, you're in an as-is contract with no ratified agreement to change the price. So the question remains, and you and I can talk offline on how to deal with that directly. The question remains, though, is how to handle that in the event you don't get an answer back. I would go to my buyer and I would say, buyer, here's where we are. This is what we've agreed on. One could argue it's binding because it's in writing via text. That's really more to communication. That's not to binding. We don't have anything in writing yet where the seller has signed off that they've done it. So what my recommendation would be, because at 601, this technically will move to as is with no changes in the contract, that we sign a termination. And if we don't have it by 5:45, I send the termination. Now, the challenge is in order to formally terminate, they would also have to turn in their termination fee.
No fee.
There's no fee.
No termination. I never do a termination fee if I can get away with it.
I'm sorry, say that again.
No termination fee.
Okay, then I would advise my buyer in that situation to send a termination and say, is my advice to you, because at 601, without having anything signed, you technically don't have an addendum So, and again, go back to the contract, right? So go back to the contract and say, at 5:45, if we're all looking at this, out of here. We do not have a new and amended contract
Correct.
because they haven't signed off on it.
Okay.
All right. I can hear from your silence that's the wonderful news you were looking for.
No, I can't believe that these 2 agents are completely non-responsive and
Right.
have not gotten back to me.
Well, shoot me an email, and if we need to, I'm willing to bet it's a non-issue. None of this is an issue until it's an issue, right? And I know that sounds really stupid. 90% of the time, yeah.
I'd like to have the paperwork. I mean, they're the ones who recommended the $25,000 drop. So
Right.
I just would like to have my paperwork.
So this goes back to, and this, by the way, I'm not picking, I appreciate you sharing this, and I'm not picking you at all. This was kind of what I was talking about earlier, right? In that situation, did not cross your mind, and one bit cross your mind based on the communication that there's any issue there. Because they were sent it to you in an email, they sent it to you in a text, there's an agreement, those sorts of things. So therein lies the challenge is we get into this a little bit of a situation, and I've been told this from the very beginning as a broker, particularly from my business partner and lovely wife, is I can be very much a stickler when it comes to the black and white of the contract. And the reason for that is because none of this is a problem until it's a problem. So what we're talking about right now, there's a 99% chance that nothing's going to come of this. However, should something come of it, all things are going to go back to, did we protect our client? Because by the way, that's the first person they're going to look to. So you just got to keep stuff like that in mind. All right, so let's continue on the conversation. Any other questions about that? All right, let's continue on the conversation about termination. So it is 5:45 on the 15th. You now have to terminate. Couple things that you need to be preparing for ahead of time. First of all, this termination fee, and we are currently working on this on the state level. This is one of the forms that's on the chopping block, not on the chopping block, but we are looking at modifying this form of the termination agreement. I'm lobbying to have the seller removed. However, you don't want to do that because it's not just the termination for the due diligence. However, a termination is a notice of termination. So this is a notice, meaning a notice. I give notice from my party to your party. It's not an acceptance of termination. It's not an agreement of termination. It is a notice of termination. So when you send a notice of termination, because it's 5:45 on the 15th, you simply have to have this filled out, your client's signature, what money needs to be in there in the agreement that in the event that it is for due diligence. It is sent. The termination fee is in. You don't need anybody else's signature. You're done. You have performed as it relates to due diligence by sending the notice of termination, which is terminate contract by timely and properly delivering notice of termination and termination fee to the seller. So the challenge becomes, and that any required termination fee has been delivered. Question that comes up often now, and we had this the other day, and I hated that she was in such a panic, but she did absolutely the thing she needed to do, is a buyer's agent from another company showed up in the Mount Pleasant office saying, hey, she was also the buyer, so that probably created the urgency. And it was late in the day. She said, I've got this termination agreement. I have no idea where this money's supposed to go. I don't have a contact information for the seller. I don't have Venmo. Termination fee is $1. Here's $1. She literally walked in the door with a $1 bill. A signed termination fee. She put it on our desk. We sent her a confirmation from the front desk. She performed on the contract. As silly and ridiculous as it seems, this girl drove to Mount Pleasant. She lives on Johns Island. She hand delivered it to the listing agent's office with a $1 bill. Again, as silly as that is, it is the absolute only way that the only thing that she should have done being in the situation she was in. If she had no other way to get the termination or more the termination fee to the seller, then that's absolutely what she should have done in that part. She completely protected herself and the buyer in that situation. So just keep in mind, if you don't figure this stuff out, and here's what's happening, and we didn't see this a lot. This, June 13th, in case you don't remember, it was a Tuesday. June 13th is when this new contract came, or the contract came out that no longer had repair procedure. We did not see a lot of this issue with the termination fee up until recently, when people started actually terminating. People weren't terminating the Q3 and 4 of last year. They were buying a house regardless of what was wrong with it. Well, now people are starting to terminate. Buyers are starting to push back. And if you don't know where or how to deliver the money to the seller, then you need to get it physically to the listing agent's office. Please don't bring cash. This one was $1, so I was okay with it. But otherwise, even if they only have cash, have them get a cashier's check or whatever it may be. Okay.
Hey, Joseph.
Otherwise, yes.
Sorry. So that was actually a deal that I was working, and she had asked if she could Venmo that $1 to our listing agent. And I just said no. Our sellers didn't have Venmo either. Is it okay for them to Venmo it? Like if Chris had been able, okay. Yeah, I just told her no. I was like, it needs to go to the seller, or you can bring it to our office. And I hate it for you. I know it's just $1, but our sellers don't live here, and they definitely don't have Venmo. So it kind of sucked for her, but
Yeah, I did so for her. I mean, nobody did anything wrong in that, right? And so, and you absolutely are correct. No, 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 never. No, do not be the conduit of any exchange of money between parties in this.
Right.
That is 100% no. Have them bring it to the office. So you did the right thing on there.
Is
Did the
there
right
any
thing.
reason that anyone would put a dollar termination in there? The craziest thing is that fell apart and it went right back under contract a couple hours later. And again, with $1 termination fee.
Yeah, if you're not going to do a substantial amount, put 0. It is not going to make a difference. A dollar is something. It's a habit that people created. It's like you have to have something. Here's what happened. Probably at some point in time, somebody told that person that was told that person that told that person that a termination fee or earnest money has to have at least a dollar in there because it's consideration for to be a valid contract. That's not the case at all. Your termination fee can absolutely be 0. And quite frankly, if you're not going to do anything, if you're not going to offer anything more than $50 to $100, which I still think is pretty low, put 0 for that very reason right there. Because would your seller have said no had it been 0 versus $1 and accepted that offer?
No, they didn't even care about the dollar. They were more bothered that I was having to ask them, like, do you have Venmo? Is there somewhere? It just turned into way more of a hassle than what that dollar was worth.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point on this. I mean, quite frankly, this may be something to consider if you're assuming there are other things you're negotiating. And I wouldn't just counter this. Like if you're going to accept the offer, otherwise I wouldn't counter it. But if you're negotiating back and forth and the termination fee is $1, like, I mean, one could argue, yeah. I mean, just make it 0 because everybody's
Right.
scrambling around. I mean, one could argue in that case had she not shown up to the house, she not shown up to the office with the $1, she technically would have been moving forward as is. Nobody wants that. Nobody's looking to win the as is and get earnest money, right? It's like they are going to move on with a contract or they're not. So, all right, let's see. Celeste, did I see your hand go up? No. Okay, so let's look back now. We got termination fee. Okay, so what's the difference? This will be the last one. This is a good discussion. The difference between termination fee and the release of agreement or contract to buy or sell real estate. Termination fee, just so there's no misunderstanding, is the foolproof way. If you're terminating under due diligence, is the absolute foolproof way to terminate a contract with no gray area. You deliver the termination form signed by your client and the fee. You're done. You have not, however, released the earnest money in the contract, which is done by Form 518. This is the release. This is where the earnest money goes. Now, read through this and don't use it as an alternative. However, if I'm Evan in the situation with Evan, and Evan comes in, stellar buyer's agent that he is, gets an inspection done within the first 3 days, finds out they're not moving forward on the property, $5,000 worth of earnest money, $1,000 termination fee. Evan comes to me and says, hey, buyers aren't moving forward. We've still got 2 weeks before due diligence. I'm just going to send the release. And the release has option 3 with $4,000 going back to the buyer and then $1,000 going to the seller. At the end of the day, it's the exact same thing. The seller got their $1,000 termination fee. The buyers got their earnest money back. Obviously, it's minus the termination fee, which would happen anyway. If the seller signs that prior to the due diligence termination or due diligence date, you don't need a notice of termination. I hesitate to even put that out there because here's what I don't want you to do. Sending just this with that written out that way is not notice of termination. Okay. Sending just this is not notice of termination. However, if you do send it and the seller signs it, and that's happened prior to the termination deadline or the due diligence deadline, then you've got it, your contract's dead. I mean, it's a full release of the contract and the earnest money is going to be distributed as you want. Seller gets the termination fee, you get the money back. So people always ask me, can we just do the release instead? The answer is yes, if you've given yourself enough time. Here's what happens. let's just be really extreme and obnoxious to make a point. Let's say that same situation happens. Evan sends this to me on the 2nd, releasing the earnest money, 4,000 goes back to him, 1,000 comes to my client, and due diligence isn't expired till the 15th. If I sit on that all the way through the 15th, even though he's moved on and I've put the house back on the market, if this isn't signed, you technically never had a terminated contract and you didn't have a contract that was released, and you now run the risk of your buyer being exposed to being under contract as is. How's that for confusing? Did I confuse you on that, or did I just say that it can be used, and honestly should be if it's well enough ahead of time, but it's not a replacement for your notice of termination as it relates to deadlines? Does that make sense? All right. Let's see what else we got. Most of the rest of the contracts, not too much on terminations. However, we're going to go through them, or excuse me, pitfalls. All right, a couple more quick ones and then we'll get you out of here. All right. Inspection, reinspection rights. Understand, this is where we're seeing quite a bit. We've got one right now that's going on where buyer wants to come back out and reinspect the property. They are allowed to reinspect the property. Sellers are nervous that why are they reinspecting? They've already asked for they've asked for repairs because they want to make sure the house that it was done properly. They want to come do measurements. Let them do the inspections. Now, again, it's ultimately up to your seller, but don't be the agent that brings the drama in on this. Well, why do they want to do more inspections? They've already inspected and asked for a ton because they want to make sure it got done. You're protected by the contract. You've already agreed on everything. Let them do it. Okay. Property, let's see. Seller shall grant buyer the right to perform a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to closing. So the final walkthrough that they're saying, technically, the seller is going to give them that. They have to give them that within 48 hours. This is the final walkthrough. This does not mean the house needs to be vacated by then. This is where we get a lot of confusion on this. It says, well, 48 hours prior to closing. No, that's to do a final walkthrough inspection. Very clearly states. I should have said this earlier. Very clearly states under closing date, no later than 5 p.m. So closing occurs when seller conveys the property buyer no later than 5 p.m. Okay. So by the way, this will be a fun one to throw curveball. Let's say we had a closing scheduled for tomorrow, March 1. Contract states the closing's March 1. Buyer schedules the closing for 9 a.m. Buyer goes to the house at 9:05 because they're running late and the seller's not out of the house yet. Is the seller in breach of contract? I got a couple heads nodding no. What about in the chat box? Put it in the chat box. You've got a closing date of March 1. The closing is scheduled for 9 a.m. At 9:05, the seller is not out of the property, or the seller in breach of contract? It's a good indication of people on video. Not video. Come on, give me some answers. Make some answers up. You got a 50-50 chance.
No, they're not in breach of contract because they have till the evening to get out, right? Don't
Thank
they 5
you.
o'clock or something?
Correct. They have until 5 p.m. Now, are they going to wait till 4:59? No, it's a terrible idea, right? But they've got until 5 p.m. This is a chat. We rerun into this all the time. Well, we had closing at 9. They didn't show up, or it's not funded. That's the other one that comes up. It wasn't funded. It hasn't funded. They're in breach. They've got until they own the property until 5 p.m. that day. So just keep that in mind. So let's go back to what we were talking about. This reinspection, 48 hours prior to closing, they can reinspect, do a final walkthrough. Seller has to let them do it. Seller will keep on all utilities through the closing. So just make sure they understand that. A couple other pitfalls. Appraisal. Appraisal comes in during due diligence. Ooh, we're going to do these via pop quizzes again. Appraisal comes in during due diligence and it underappraises and the seller refuses to drop the price. Buyer gets out of the, we're still in due diligence. So the buyer gets out of the contract because of the appraisal. Do they owe the termination fee? I got 2 no's. Got a couple different no's. See, you guys are so smart. That is correct. They do not owe the termination fee. by the way, I ask these questions because I've run into situations, and this happened quite a bit in the beginning. It's like, well, it's during due diligence, so they have to pay the termination fee. Okay, no judgment. I understand. I can see where that would be feedback. And if that's the case, then just wait to terminate until because of the appraisal until after the termination, or excuse me, the due diligence. So just keep in mind, same thing applies during due diligence. You have an unclear CL 100, and during due diligence, you submit a request for the CL 100 to be repaired, and the seller says no during due diligence. So you opt to terminate because the seller is not going to fix and bring a clean CL 100. If that happens, sorry, I'm not sharing screen. If that happens during due diligence, sorry, go back to this one. Let's say during that same time frame, you get the wood infestation report, they need a clear CL 100, the seller refuses to do it, so the buyer terminates during due diligence. Do they owe the termination fee? Got two no's in the smiling faces on the screens. Answer is no. So those are the ones that are separate from it. All right, so last pop quiz. You've gotten through due diligence, or no, yeah, you've gotten through due diligence. No, you're still in due diligence. Sorry. Help if you know the questions for the pop quiz, right? You're still in due diligence. Say it's a long due diligence. It appraised, wood infestation report got taken care of, but financing didn't come through. Got denied financing during due diligence. Terminate during due diligence. Do you owe a termination fee? That one's kind of a trick one. You really don't ever owe a termination
Was
fee
it
for
contingent on
financing.
financing?
Wow, Wayne, stepping up with the clarification. Well done, sir. Yes, it was contingent on financing. Good call. Good call. You guys are correct. No termination fee. Now, this is all pretty in a perfect world, right? No termination fee. Oh, it's contingent on this and you terminate it. That doesn't mean there won't be issues. There won't be pushback. Right? Will there be argument for earnest money? Will there be argument for anything else? 100%. There could be. So, all right, let me look and see anything else we're seeing. Oh, one more. Keep saying one more. Let me make sure it's only one. Yes, I'm going to go with one more. This one we are seeing quite a bit. This will be good. I'm gonna show paragraph 16. This is the only place, quite frankly, this is by signing this agreement, you have two options. They either filled it out or they didn't. This right here is the only place that your buyer should be agreeing in writing to not, or to move forward without a property disclosure. We're seeing this a lot right now where people are wanting the exemption form for property disclosures, property condition disclosures. There are, I can honestly say it would be hard to find a transaction that we've done as an organization over the last 2 years that the seller is truly exempt from filling out a property disclosure. That it just doesn't happen. And we get mixed up in a lot of different ones, and people talk about, well, they're exempt for it for different ways. So let's do that as a pop quiz. What are some areas that you've dealt with or will be dealing with where your seller will be exempt from the property disclosure? You can either write it.
The state.
They're selling it for the estate. So tell me what that means, like specifically. Let's say you're the seller. What's the situation?
So it's an inherited property and they honestly don't know what, they never lived there. They never knew anything about the property.
Okay, so a handful of things you just said are all reasons that are given to be exempt, and none of them apply. Here's why. So let's say you inherited the property. Let's say you're the heir, you truly inherited the property. The exemption for that is you didn't need the property disclosure for the transfer of the property from whoever you inherited it to you. That's where the property disclosure is exempt, not for you to then turn around and sell it. That's where the confusion comes in that. So you have a family member that passes away, or whoever, rich uncle that passes away, you inherit the house. That's a transfer of property from them to you. That's where the property disclosure is not required. You turn around and sell it, it is required. You're not exempt from that. The next one that comes in is never lived in. There's nowhere in there that says if you've never lived in the house, you're exempt from it. So never lived in is not an exemption. Okay, where else? This is good. This is good. Like to hear this.
Raw land,
Say that again.
raw land. So no
Raw-
house, just land.
Well, correct. Yeah, I mean, that's correct. Sorry. Raw land and new construction don't have it. So yeah, that would not be on there. Anywhere else? So this is why and this was a mistake that the MLS made years ago. The MLS created some bogus document from the South Carolina Real Estate Commission that basically says this is a corporate ownership. I need to double check on that on corporate ownership, Jan. I don't think it falls into that though. Let me double check. So I'll shoot an email out on that. That's a really good question. What I do want to do is share with you the form that is needed, in case you don't know. So if you go to CHS MLS documents, which is at chmls.com/documents, you down here, fine appeal. I know a lot of you know where that is. It's the South Carolina Property Condition Disclosure Notice Form. So this notice form is a notice that you give to your seller. And so I get this a lot. The seller says, they're going to sign this because they don't need to fill it out. The law specifically says that they have to fill it out. This notice form basically says that the property disclosure, also known as seller's disclosure, is not uploaded to the MLS system. The listing brokerage has informed the seller to obtain legal counsel regarding the property condition disclosure statement and all of the legal issues involved with this real estate transaction. At the time, the sellers decided against completing or uploading their property disclosure into the MLS. Buyer side brokerage may contact the listing brokerage for any updates in the future. So again, this kind of goes back to, choose your battles on it. I mean, it's a little bit, we're basically just following the letter of the law with this, because I'll be honest with you, I also feel that the property disclosure is worth the weight that it's written on. Right. So at the end of the day, the fact that so much weight is put into this, here's a little known fact about the property disclosure is that it does create a level of indemnification between us as the agents and brokerage and any sort of lawsuit in the transaction. So by having that filled out, if something moves forward, we have one more level of protection for us. Not saying obviously you're not going to go to your seller and say, fill it out for me, because they're going to be like, that's nice. It also gives them a level of disclosure, because the property disclosure specifically states, I'm filling this out to the best of my knowledge, but I'm also not a professional. Right. And there could be things, I mean, we see property disclosure things come up all the time. We had one years ago where, and people freak out about it. Right. We had one years ago where the seller had lived in the house for quite a period of time, had extensive work done to the kitchen, and when was filling out the property disclosure, just did not think about it and put no representation. Didn't answer yes, didn't answer no, just said, I don't know one way or the other. And when the buyer found out, they're like freaked out. It's like, well, again, the property disclosure specifically states, hey, I may not know. And oh, by the way, there's parts of the contract that some attorneys in the state will argue negate the property disclosure altogether. That being said, we have to play by the rules. And the rules state that there are very few exemptions, and I'm gonna look those up. Look up the corporate ownership one. All right. Give me some questions. What's some questions that you have? I'm gonna be looking up while you're doing this. So take yourself off of mute and ask them. I'm gonna try to find Jan's answer on that one really quickly.
Not a question, but more so a comment. I don't think a lot of people know about the not having to use or that, probated property is not an exemption for filling out
Yeah.
the property disclosure.
And that was one of the reasons that when the exemption form that was created on a local level, it was not understood by the local people that created it as well, which caused even more confusion in Charleston. But yeah, there is a, yeah, it is a bit of a, I'm looking at license law. I'll have to look that one up, Jan. I will get it to you though. It's a good one. Now I'm super curious, as you can tell. All right. Any other questions? If not, give me 5 ahas and we'll get out of here.
People accept
everything in
contracts
writing.
with a dollar due diligence. Termination.
People accept contracts with the dollar due diligence termination. Okay. It's crazy because that $1 not being turned in is the difference between a buyer being released from a contract and a buyer moving forward as is on a contract.
That's crazy.
Oh, Wayne, what were you saying?
Get everything in writing.
Everything in writing. The big one where we're seeing that now, and I'm probably going to do the next broker minute on it. The big one we're seeing that right now is a lot of we have 2 right now that are on my desk that have to do with a buyer that went in and did repairs prior to closing. And they didn't go so well. And now the house is not closing. So now we have an issue of, well, what did we really agree to? Those sorts of things. Jan made a really good point in here, and I could not agree with this more. It says all too often too much weight is placed on the buyer and seller's disclosure rather than on the inspection. Sorry, placed by the buyer on the seller's disclosure rather than the inspection. And that needs to be part, I mean, that's part of your buyer consultation to say, listen, this is a representation of what someone knew when they sat at their kitchen table while they're also planning in their mind, packing their house, moving, whatever life event, everything they have going on. They're filling out this 7-page document that no one's allowed to help them fill out, right? So just understand, when we read this, we're still going to have the house inspected. And oh, by the way, this brings up another good point. If something comes up in the inspection that's contrary to the property disclosure, work very hard to be the professional in that and not stir the pot that this was some sort of giant conspiracy by the seller to absolutely get one over on the buyer. I mean, we're seeing that so much right now, where the buyers and the buyer's agents are a part of this, is that people are freaking out. It's just like, well, they lied. They didn't lie. I mean, let's not go there first. Like, we've got it inspected. Let's move forward, or not. That's fine. Now, are there possible disclosure issues and misrepresentation issues? Sure, possibly, but let's not jump to that. I learned not to put an expiration date on the repair addendum prior to the day. I thought the date was required. Yeah, that's yeah. We can go that one. If anything goes wrong with that legally, we'll just blame Celeste. All right, so we got 2 ahas, 3 more ahas, and we'll be done. All right, 1 more aha. All right, I'll give you one. I'm not, also 0 is okay for due diligence. I'll take it. Yep. Love it. Love it. All right, Shonda, thank you. All right, guys, I'm going to change up my next broker minute. It'll be short and sweet, and it's going to be answering the question on corporate ownership for property disclosure. So thank you, Jan. By the way, speaking of, you have short questions or things that come up and you want the answers for that, please let me know. They also make great broker minute videos. We'll get more of those out. You guys have an awesome day. We'll post this. Be posted hopefully by the end of the day, if not tomorrow. Let me know how I can help you.
Thanks, Joseph. Joseph, one quick thing.
guys.
that
Thank you,
doesn't pertain-
Joseph.
One
Yeah, go ahead.
thing that doesn't pertain to this.
Uh-huh.
Somebody just had a closing last month.